They are the few remaining people who've lived through a nuclear war, and they've just been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
But has the world learnt the lessons of the catastrophic events of 1945? And how worried should we be about another nuclear war?
New threats from Russia and North Korea, an unpredictable Donald Trump heading back to the White House, and wars raging in Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine. The world is on edge.
Weapons exist to be used.
The risk of nuclear warfare is at its highest since the Cold War.
Alarm after alarm, survivor after survivor are calling the world back from the brink.
That's why this year's Nobel Peace Prize has gone to Nihon Hidankyo, a grassroots movement of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors.
Nuclear weapons and humanity cannot coexist.
It's almost 80 years since the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, the first and only time nuclear weapons have been used in war.
The survivors, or hibakusha as they're known, have dedicated their lives to impressing on the world why nuclear weapons should never be used again.
And with the nuclear taboo under more pressure than ever, keeping alive the horrors of nuclear war has never been so important.
My life has been a living hell. I don't want anyone else to experience such hell.
Hello and welcome to the Nobel interview, an Al Jazeera special live from Oslo. I'm James Bays.
And I'm Folly Thibault. Right here at Oslo City Hall just a few hours ago, Nihon Hidankyo, the Japanese group of atomic bomb survivors, received the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize.
Over the next hour, we'll be speaking to 2 of the group's co-chairs about their experience and their efforts to rid the world of nuclear weapons.
And we will also be hearing from some of the world's top experts on nuclear security about the threats we face today at a time of heightened global tensions.
So how worried are you about the threat of nuclear warfare, nuclear weapons? We've got a poll up and running on X, and we'd like you to take part in that poll. Use the hashtag AJNobel.
Shigemitsu, Tanaka, Toshiyuki, Mimaki, congratulations on winning the Nobel Peace Prize.
Mr. Tanaka, can I start with you? How important is this award to you, to your work, and to your mission?
Yes, for us and all of our predecessors, the hibakusha who have gone before us within so much suffering, doing all that they can in order to eradicate nuclear weapons from this world, forging the path forward. And we have followed in their footsteps, all of our seniors who have gone before us. So now receiving the Nobel Peace Prize and thinking of all those who've gone before us, I want to express how thankful I am to them. And this prize is for all of the survivors, all hibakusha.
Mr. Mimaki, what was your reaction when you heard the news, your first thoughts when you heard that Nihon Hidankyo had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize?
I was at the time 11th of October 2024, I was in the Hiroshima City Hall at the time watching the announcement, and I was expecting that the prize this year would go to people working for peace in Gaza. And expecting that, I heard the words of the committee chair saying, Nihon something, but I couldn't really hear very well what he said at first. But then all of the press in front said, it's Nihon Hidankyo. When I heard this, I was just so shocked, so surprised. I was just overwhelmed.
Yeah. We saw the
So
emotion.
all of those who have gone before us are the other survivors who have passed away. The path that they have followed, this is the result of all of their work.
Yeah, we saw your reaction and the emotion, and we did indeed hear you say that you thought that the people working in Gaza deserved this Nobel Peace Prize, and you compared the situation of children in Gaza today to the situation in Japan in 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm curious to know, what lessons do you think, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki are relevant to today's conflicts, including the war on Gaza right now?
When we have this threat of nuclear weapons potentially being used, and there are weapons which could be launched at any time around the world, even on Gaza, so I think what we can do to stop this and to stop war as well. The Nobel Peace Prize is something that we're receiving this. We feel that this is our mission, seeing that what we can do to put the brakes on ensuring that nuclear weapons will never be used again.
Mr. Tanaka, it's almost 80 years since the bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Why do you think it's taken so long for the survivors, the Hibakusha, to be recognized on the global stage like this?
Our activities, our work until now is it doesn't stand out so much. It's just little by little, things that doesn't really people do not pay so much attention to. It's just doing what we can day by day. It's very grassroots movement that we're continuing to do, but I think this has little by little spread around the world. And finally, our efforts, the reality of what we experienced with the atomic bombs, and knowing that nuclear weapons are weapons which are so inhumane, it's finally being understood by more people around the world. And also looking at the international political situation today in Ukraine, in Gaza, looking at the threat of nuclear weapons potentially being used once again, this risk is higher than it has ever been before. We are really at a very urgent time now. And so within such a situation, we feel that our efforts working to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons, our appeal has now been heard, been recognized, and so now Nihon Hidankyo receiving, I think this is why they decided that it was time that our organization should receive the Peace Prize.
Gentlemen, let's pause there for a moment and remind ourselves of the enormity of what we're talking about. It was 1945, the final year of World War II, and Japan refused to surrender. Early, on August the 6th, the US dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by a larger plutonium bomb on Nagasaki.
目の前がピカーッと光ったいうのが何かわからないですよね。ドーンという轟音とともにね、若いのがぺしゃんこになったんです。
The Allies achieved their aim. Japan surrendered. But the impact was catastrophic.
あっちからも火の手が上がる、こっちからも火の手が上がるって街はもう火の海です。弟が人の波に連なってきたんです。それは顔も全部ここへぶら下がって。
In Hiroshima, the blast killed and destroyed almost everything within a 2-kilometer radius. By the end of the year, more than 140,000 people had died there, and at least 70,000 in Nagasaki.
お友達を助けることができなかったとですね。それがまず最初の心の痛みですね。途中も結構死体がもうコロコロ転がって歩くのにやっとそれを避けて歩くっていうか。
For years, what happened was concealed. Suffering increased rates of leukemia and cancer, the survivors were ostracized for fear of being contagious. Many took their own lives. That led local Hibakusha associations to form Nihon Hidankyo in 1956 to lobby for better support for the survivors and the abolition of nuclear weapons. Despite their painful memories, the Hibakusha have worked tirelessly for decades, protesting addressing international conferences and telling their story to younger generations in Japan and around the world.
頑張って生きてます。でも私たちもういなくなるんですよ。だからいなくなった後は
Mr. Mimaki, it was the 6th of August, 1945, 8:15 in the morning, and you were just 3 years old when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. What do you remember from that day? What did you see?
My father had been working for the railroads at the time in the city of Hiroshima, so he was under the bomb directly then. We had been living a little way away from the city, and it was the next day that we went into the center to try and see what happened to him. So while I was not directly under the bomb on that day, the next day we went in and were exposed to the radiation then. We couldn't find our father for 3 days then, but we continued to try and look for him, but couldn't tell anywhere where he was. The whole city, it was completely gone. It had been such a beautiful city, but everything was disappeared. There were corpses everywhere, throughout the ground, throughout the city. It was, as you're walking through, you saw flies, maggots, this horrific situation, which we'd never even imagined, these scenes that you'd never seen before, could never even imagine. And so I remember how fearful that scene was.
Mr. Tanaka, 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. You were just 4 years old at the time. Can I ask you what you remember and what you remember of the weeks that followed?
I was, at the time, 4 years old, and we were around 6 kilometers away from the hypocenter. And at that time, we had been having a large spring cleaning, and together with my grandparents, and also as we were playing under some persimmon tree in Nagasaki, but then their plane came. I was trying to look and seek for that plane because I could hear the sound in the sky, and as I looked towards the center of the city of Nagasaki, all of a sudden, there was this intense white light, and just a few seconds later, we heard the sound of the explosion and the blast of the wind. The shock came towards us. The glass in our home was completely destroyed. The doors were blown through the house. Somehow, miraculously, we were able to, the 6 members of our family were able to survive. Our father, through the orders of the military, went in to support the relief efforts in the center of Nagasaki after that. And then my mother, older brother, and younger brother as well were close to the hypocenter, looking for what had happened to my mother's friends who were living very close. So they were exposed to the radiation when they were seeking their friends to find out what happened. When the 3 came back home as well, they were completely impacted by this. My mother, she had many flies and so on. Also, the wounds became seeping and did not fix. They were not relieved for 6 months after that. Then also had impact to the internal organs due to the impact of the radiation.
You have something to show us.
This photograph, please look at this. This is the hypocenter close to that area. This is a photograph filmed 2 days before, on August 7, in Nagasaki by the U.S. military. You can see each of these every homes. However, after the bomb, all of these homes which had been in this area became like this. There was nothing left, not a single house. We can see it's all destroyed. All of them, it was just burned, charred remains. This also, through the blast, people were buried under their homes. Within this photograph, so many people, even if they survived right away, they were then buried underground and died in this way. This is what is under these scenes in the photograph.
So did you consider yourself, look at those awful pictures, did you consider yourself lucky to have survived? Is that how you felt?
Well, because there was somewhat of a distance to our home, somehow I was able to survive without injury at the time, I believe. However, after that, our lives were very challenging. There was nothing to eat. There was nothing to wear. All Japanese people, even before that, had been suffering from malnutrition, but we suffered greatly after the bombing.
Yes. For many of the survivors, Mr. Mimaki, there was the guilt of having survived, but there was also the stigma. And in Japan, many hibakushas faced discrimination in the years that followed the bomb. How big of a difference has Nihon Hidankyo made in lessening that stigma that the hibakushas face? And I've got a question here from one of our audience that's come to us from Instagram. This is from Venance Majula, who asks, how do the personal experiences of the survivors shape policy and also public opinion?
Yes. Well, at the time when I was in the 5th year of elementary school, I became very ill, and I had to be away from school for 4 months, and everybody expected that I would die, that I wouldn't survive. But there was some new medicine which had been imported from the United States, and so I had some injections and was somehow able to become better from them and able to graduate from elementary school after that. However, all of our neighbors looked and they said, well, he's ill, he's weak, he will never survive. So when I went to get married, because I didn't actually marry someone from within Hiroshima, because we were fearful of what would happen to our children, what kind of impacts there might be. So many people were concerned about this. So I actually didn't marry someone from the same Hiroshima. I married someone from Hyogo, a different part of Japan. We were so fearful about what would happen. And so these kind of situations, discrimination, prejudice, continued so much. So we did what we can to raise our children, to live, just did everything I could, just even to survive and have a regular life after that. And it was after my children became old enough that I started very seriously to become involved in the peace movement. But from the time when I was very young, I was always, I was working as the head of the PTA in the school, or also, I was always saying, many things in terms of, also I was working in the town association and so on, and finally became involved in peace activism after many years. But Mr. Thibault, who was one of the predecessors, the leaders of the hibakusha movement, I followed his footsteps and continued in the work until today. But when I remember, it's because of all of the people from Hiroshima who went before us, their activities that led us to receive the Peace Prize today. And after I go home, I hope to go to the Peace Park and report this to them.
Yeah, and so how do you think your experience as survivors shapes policy within Japan, but also internationally? How did it influence international policy?
For us, we are often in somewhat opposition to the Japanese government because Japan is relying on dependence on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was recently adopted by the UN, and the second meeting of states parties took place last year. I've attended these as well, but Japan doesn't even attend these meetings. It doesn't even come as an observer. Germany or other countries do attend this as an observer, but why the Japanese government won't even go to the meetings? The next meeting of state parties is in March. And I really hope that the Japanese government will this time attend at least as an observer. We continue to appeal strongly to the Japanese government for this.
And we hope they hear your appeal. Mr. Tanaka, what personal stories from your experience as survivors do you think are most important for the world to hear today?
For us, our experience as the hibakusha, what we went through, want people around the world, no matter what country they're in, this is something that no one must ever be allowed to experience again. This is why we are continuing our movement. And especially for us, in another 10 years, 15 years, there will be none of us left. And so thinking about this world with no hibakusha left, still alive, what kind of movement should continue after this? What our experience, how young people can, for future generations as well, take on our message, take on the baton that we are passing to them, and ensure that we can rid the world both of nuclear weapons and of war. This is the kind of work that I hope that they will work towards.
But is it also painful for you to keep talking about this, to keep talking about what you went through and the experience of surviving nuclear bombs?
Yes. For my grandchild, also, after they were born, 3 days later, actually, they passed away, even just as a child. And this was also due to impacts on the internal organs at the time. This was impacting, and their lungs were not able to grow properly. There was impact on their diaphragm as well. And their temperature, their body temperature fell to 30. And when I held my grandchild, this baby, I knew that, well, what we went through, it had been passed on even to these future generations, passed away after just 3 days. And so looking at what this means, because of this, my daughter went on to divorce and had such sadness following as well. Our whole family has been impacted for generations.
Gentlemen, as we said at the beginning of the programme, you're not just going to get questions from me and from Folly. We've got an audience here, and they want to speak to you as well. So we're going to take some questions from our audience. We've also got top nuclear experts and international officials here we're going to be hearing from in a moment as well. But let's start with the first question we have from an audience member. Can I have your name and your question, please?
Yes.
To the laureates.
Yes. Hi, I'm Alma, and my question is that as the Hibakusha die out, who's going to take over your important task?
Mr. Mimaki, if you could take that question.
As the Hibakusha die out, she says, once your voice is gone, who will take over the important task of relaying your message?
So in Hiroshima, the city has actually started a system for people who are passing on the testimonies of the Hibakusha. So we tell our stories to young people. They take on our stories, and then instead of me, they share my story, my testimony on behalf. This is a system that the city has developed. And so after we have all passed away, after there is no more Hibakusha, the issues of nuclear weapons and of war and of peace as well, this is something that we hope that young people will take on this message, that they will continue to talk about this as well. So this is one step that the Hiroshima city has started. But as well as that, it is the young people, what they can do to say that, well, nuclear weapons, we cannot allow them. And so I hope that they will become involved in the work as well. In Hiroshima, there is the Peace Park, which is visited by many people from around the world as well. And so I hope that through this opportunity, many more people from different countries will also come to Hiroshima, will visit. Look, in the museum, you will see what happened to all of the young boys and girls in Hiroshima at the time. You can see their clothing, which has been burned away. But they were never able to grow up to see television, to ride on a bullet train. Their lives were taken away when they were so small. So this is what happens when nuclear weapons are used. So we hope that young people will learn about this reality and help to create a world where nuclear weapons will never be used as well again. And it is, of course, states which wage war, but it is citizens who are sacrificed, and particularly children who are impacted.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Mimaki and Mr. Tanaka, let's look at the current threats today. 7 years ago, it was ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, collecting the Nobel Peace Prize after the adoption of a global treaty to ban nuclear weapons. 94 countries have now signed up, but has it had an impact on global stockpiles? Take a look. There are currently estimated to be more than 12,000 nuclear warheads in the world. The number has been declining as the US and Russia dismantle retired warheads. But between them, they still possess 88% of nuclear weapons, which they're replacing and modernizing. Last year, the 9 nuclear-armed states spent $91.4 billion on their arsenals. That's $10.8 billion more than the year before and almost $3,000 a second. The U.S. accounted for 80% of the rise, spending $51.5 billion. In the last 7 years, Russia has gone from 7,000 nuclear weapons to 5,580. China has dramatically increased its stockpile. It's estimated to have 500 weapons, up from 270 in 7 years. While North Korea is thought to have gone from 10 to 50 nuclear warheads. Israel has not formally acknowledged its nuclear program, but is estimated to have 90 warheads.
Well, as you heard there, back in 2017, it was the campaign organisation ICANN that won the Nobel Peace Prize. Melissa Park is the executive director of ICANN's with me now. Melissa, given that success back then, how much of the foundation of that and foundation for all your work is the work of these people?
Well, the testimonies, the courage of the Hibakusha to relive that childhood trauma again and again, to tell those stories again and again, has been absolutely critical to changing the narrative around nuclear weapons. For decades, the narrative was controlled primarily by those who have nuclear weapons, and their message was nuclear weapons provide stability and security. Well, a series of humanitarian initiatives, beginning here in Norway in 2013, changed the conversation by focusing the conversation instead on what would happen if, or more likely when, nuclear weapons are ever used. And they highlighted the real security impact of nuclear weapons by looking at the incontrovertible evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki and from the more than 2,000 nuclear weapons tests that have been carried out around the world, that nuclear weapons cause indiscriminate, catastrophic harm to humans and the environment across long periods of time and across vast distances. And these conversations empowered and enabled a broad range of stakeholders to stand up and demand a policy shift, including countries from the global south that have been traditionally marginalised in this debate, communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, civil society, academics, and so on, to demand that shift, and thereby the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into being with the support of 122 countries.
And yes, you've slowly been gathering support for that treaty since. But at the same time, nuclear tension around the world seems to be growing. Are we going forward or backwards? How do you judge things right now?
Well, yes, we are in times of great tension and mistrust, and we're at a crossroads. Humanity is at a crossroads. Do we continue to take this path of confrontation, militarisation and proliferation? Or do we take a different path, and that is of dialogue, disarmament, diplomacy and disarmament, which is really provided through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is an important advance in international law and multilateralism at a time when we're seeing those things increasingly under threat. And, you know, the dinosaurs did not have the option of avoiding the asteroid that made them extinct. We actually have a choice here. We can choose to eliminate nuclear weapons, which are an existential threat. So, and there's the author Yuval Noah Harari, who talks about the power of human imagination to redirect our ingenuity from self-destruction to self-creation. And this is what we're doing with the TPNW. We're redirecting our ingenuity to reimagine peace and to build a new world, a new future that respects the earth and each other without nuclear weapons in it.
Melissa Park of ICANN, thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Tanaka, we've heard threats from a number of leaders. Who frightens you today the most with regards to starting a nuclear war? Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump, or Vladimir Putin?
Very quietly.
So, for each of these leaders, they need to, I don't think they're really thinking about what it means to wage war upon people, what these impacts actually are. So if people can enter into dialogue together, enter into diplomacy, I think that they can come to more of an understanding. We need to put the weapons down. I just call on them to talk to each other. If a war has started, to talk, to enter into dialogue, even one day earlier. This is what is most important. So if wars are being waged, nuclear weapons, if they are used, well, this could happen again in the future. This must not be allowed to happen. We must avoid this at all costs.
Mr. Mimaki, do you think this is the most dangerous moment we've faced in the last 80 years?
Yes, I do think so, of course. If nuclear weapons were, for example, dropped on a country in Europe, of course, it's not limited to only that country. The whole of Europe will be impacted by the radiation. It would be incredible impacts. And so today, when we look at the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there is also Ms. Nakamitsu from the United Nations who has played a great role towards this nuclear ban treaty. But nuclear weapons, if we work towards both the elimination of nuclear weapons and to permanent peace, I think leaders of the world need to think about this once again. I call on them to do so.
OK, well, we've just heard about the threats around the world, and we've heard that searing testimony from our laureates. I'm joined by Rafael Grossi, who's the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, how worried should we be? You're dealing with things like Iran, where enrichment is going up close to weapons grade. You're dealing with North Korea, where you don't really know what's going on at all, do you? Should we be very worried?
Yeah, we should. I think, of course, the testimony of the Hibakusha is fundamental as a moral, compelling message. We at the IEA have the more modest but equally necessary job to take care of the world as it is. And we are living in a world of enormous complexity, where, unfortunately, the attraction of nuclear weapons is not diminishing, it is increasing. And the numbers of nuclear weapons are increasing at the same time. What we try to do from the IEA is to make sure that no more countries get into this list of the ones that were mentioned before, and that we can offer avenues, concrete measures to avoid that from happening. You mentioned North Korea, a country that was in a process of negotiation to try to avoid the red line to be crossed. We failed. We failed collectively, because that happened. We are doing exactly the same with Iran now.
And is diplomacy the answer? Because there are some Israeli ministers, there are some close to Donald Trump, who will soon be the US president, who say the answer is to bomb Iran's nuclear program. What would that do?
Certainly, diplomacy is the answer, is the only answer, on the basis of technically sound ways to get to a result, without ignoring that there are tensions out there. The other way, well, we've seen what may happen, and the Hibakusha are here to remind us of what the consequences of ignoring the perils of the use of nuclear weapons would be. But that requires painstaking work. Results are not easy to be achieved. Modesty, but perseverance, and this is what we do.
Now, you've been 10 times, I think, to Ukraine since the war started there in Ukraine. How worried are you about that, and also about, as a result of it, the rising rhetoric that we're hearing, some of these threats we're hearing, or veiled threats coming from Moscow?
But it's part of the same. It's a world which is more and more fragmented. We have to recognize that this is the case. And of course, with this fragmentation comes tension, and having nuclear weapons around make them a possible instrument of war. And this taboo, I think, that was mentioned at the beginning of the show, about all of us recognizing that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, is evaporating. And so we should be reminded of this, but the way to avoid this from happening is through concrete actions and work. Appeals are important, awareness is important, education is indispensable. At the same time, we have to do our inspection work, we have to work on every front. What we do in Ukraine is a good example of that, of an international organization that does not just tweets about things, does something about it.
In Ukraine, though, we're talking about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That's supposed to be a civilian nuclear power plant, and it's on the front line. It's basically been weaponized. Does that not show us the dangers of civilian nuclear power, potentially?
Well, I don't think that correlation is automatic. Nuclear power, nuclear energy, like any other industrial activity, if manipulated in the midst of a war, can become, of course, a problematic issue. Here, the problem is the war, and what we are doing there to prevent peaceful facility, a facility that used to provide 20% of the energy of this country, which is facing a long, cold and dark winter, it was a force for good. What we have to prevent is this place to be transformed into something that would cause more misery to what we are doing now. Today, as we were assisting to this very moving ceremony, I got word that one of the vehicles of the IAEA was attacked. This vehicle was bringing inspectors that were supposed to be taking care of the safety of this facility. That tells you how close we are to these dangers, and we are going to, of course, not be deterred from what we need to do to make sure that what you endured never, ever happens again.
Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, thank you for talking to us. Folly.
James, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Grossi, as well. Mr. Mimaki, Mr. Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, represents the global system that's been dealing with this nuclear threat. With respect to him, do you think it's a system that actually works today?
So what I think that when we look at the situation, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and also the United States and NATO is, of course, supporting Ukraine, but because maybe this is not completely successful, we can see that the war is being prolonged. It is continuing, and there is no end in sight at the moment. So the people of Ukraine are, of course, in such difficult circumstances at the moment. They don't know what their next day will be. This is the kind of lives that they are under at the moment. When we see Israel and what it is doing in Gaza as well, so many people are dying there as well. And so people don't know whether they will ever be able to survive another day. This is the kind of situation. The children as well, they're not able to access education, not able to access food, for example. But the politicians of the world, I hope that they can somehow bring an end to this.
Yeah. Well, you know, in the lead up to this show, we asked our audience around the world about their thoughts and how worried they are about an imminent nuclear war in the very near future. And we'll have those poll results for you in just a moment. But first, we've also been talking to people in the countries that are most affected and most at risk today. Take a look at what they've had to say.
Putin will never use nuclear weapons first, 1,000%.
This worries me very much because I have children.
I believe this is more political rhetoric.
If he wants to do it, he would have already done it.
Why should we be afraid? He's threatening us with something new every day.
I just don't think Putin would do that. I mean, he would destroy his own country. Why would he do that? Because we would surely retaliate.
I'm not saying it's the thing that keeps me up at night. I think probably the climate crisis is a little bit more forefront on my mind.
I am truly afraid. Nuclear weapons should never be used.
People my age don't really pay much attention to topics like this, so I rarely thought of them as dangerous.
So you heard there from people from Kharkiv in Ukraine, from Moscow, from the US, and from Seoul about how worried they are. And we have now our results to the poll that we asked in the lead up to this special show here in Oslo about how worried you are about a nuclear war in the very near future. Well, we've got the results here posted on X, formerly Twitter. And 43% of you are extremely worried about a nuclear war in the very near future. 32% of you are slightly worried, and 25% not worried at all. James.
Mr. Mimaki, what do you make of those results? 43% extremely worried about nuclear warfare, and then the last part of that, in the near future.
So at the moment, looking at where nuclear weapons could potentially be used, I really feel concerned about this myself also. So at the very least, I think about my grandchildren's generation. Of course, any country, even Japan, would be impacted by any new war that might start as well. When I think about, if I imagine my grandchildren having to enter a shelter, when I think about this, of course, having to even teach them about anything like this as well is such a situation that should not be allowed. So the world, of course, I wish that countries, people could get on together better, but there is so many divisions, polarization, and so we see these, fights, arguments between countries turn into war, which then turns into the higher risk of nuclear weapons as well. So thinking about whether our own country, people might be then urged or tempted to use nuclear weapons if they feel that their own country is in a difficult situation. Therefore, politicians of the world need to come together to learn from this and to make sure that this is not allowed to happen. So I hope this is the kind of politics that they can do around the world to ensure that people, of course, maybe their political positions may be different, but all countries should agree that war is something that should not be allowed.
Well, James, I'm now joined by two more nuclear experts who are here in our audience. Wilfried Wan is director of the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at SIPRI, and Hans Christensen is from the International Federation, the director of Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, I should say. Hans, let me start with you. We've been talking about the weapons that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When you compare it to what there is out there today, the stockpiles, the programs that are out there today, how would they compare? What would happen if the weapons that we have today that some of these countries possess were to be used?
Well, so the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki today are actually considered low-yield nuclear weapons. We have weapons on missiles, long-range missiles, various cruise missiles, what have you, around the world. They typically have yields in the order of several hundred kiloton. The largest weapon that is in the U.S. arsenal is 1.2 megaton, one single bomb. So that's like 80 times the Hiroshima bomb. And so there's a great variety of nuclear weapons that are out there. Most of them have these high yields that we talk about.
Right. Wilfried Wan, I mean, the global treaties, how do we make them work when the decisions about nuclear weapons and, the way they're used, that decision lies in the hands of just a few leaders? I mean, the U.S. president, soon to be Donald Trump, can make this decision to launch the nuclear weapon on his own by the push of a button. That's quite worrying, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it really underlines the inherent risk of nuclear weapons. There is really no right hands for these wrong weapons, as the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon once said. There is just the inherent risk of use with weapons of mass destruction, and so disarmament is really the only way forward. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the risk of use exists.
All right, disarmament, the only way forward. James.
Yes, well, we've been talking about the horror of nuclear war, but of course, conventional warfare is causing devastation. Look at places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Gaza. Mr. Tanaka, those places are going to have trauma for generations. Do you see parallels to what happened in Japan?
For us, when we see on television scenes of wars around the world, when we hear about what is happening, through watching, hearing these scenes, we remember what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki 79 years ago. All of this comes flooding back to our memories, and it is so painful to see. When we can't think about this as something that is just happening to other people, imagining that this is something that could happen to us, I hope that everybody can think about this as something personal, directly related to them. And getting rid of nuclear weapons is for the Hibakusha, not only the first and even second generation. It's not only a matter of us, but for people all around the world to see this as their own issue, to think about this, and to see how they can take action to build peace, to rid the world of nuclear weapons. weapons. I hope that people can proactively become involved in different movements in order to do this. And it is only through doing so that we will be able to create the public opinion to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and that the nuclear weapon states can also then be engaged towards this as well. I think this is what is important.
Mr. Mimaki, how would you say we should try and put the world back on a safer track? Because we're not going in the right direction, are we?
Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
the nuclear weapons that were used in these two cities was from the analog time. It was a completely different period. Now the world has become digitalized, everything is computerized. Even with a very small bomb, it has a huge yield, it can have a huge impact as well. These nuclear weapons, rather than developing these things, I hope that scientists around the world, in the nuclear weapon states, they're focusing on just creating these new weapons or developing them even further, conducting nuclear tests still, or also even, looking at different experiments, even on the level of being critical and so on. Every time we see this, we have sit-in demonstrations in the Peace Park in Hiroshima against these nuclear tests. In the sit-in, of course, this is not enough to convey to the whole world. So this is why days such as today, such as the Nobel Peace Prize, being awarded to Nihon Hidankyo, is an opportunity for this message to reach beyond Hiroshima, but to the whole entire world. And so I hope at the very least we can look at what it means to have nuclear weapons, what it means to use nuclear weapons. I hope that this can be an opportunity for people to think about this as well. Japan has recently had a new prime minister. There will be soon a new president coming into the United States. We see the situation in South Korea, Germany, France. There, of course, it's a time when we don't know who the next leaders of each of these countries. We don't know what direction the world will go towards, but I'm very concerned.
Okay, James, I'm here now with Izumi Nakamitsu, the United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Ms. Nakamitsu, you are a top UN official, of course, but also Japanese. So I wanted to know, what does the legacy, and will the legacy of the Hibakusha mean to you both as an expert, but also as a human being?
Well, they have been a significant source of our inspiration at the United Nations. Many of the practitioners, diplomats, policymakers, those who work in disarmament area, I think most of them have heard their stories, and that have really inspired them. They felt that this is an issue, this is a challenge that is worth pursuing and resolving throughout their career. So they have already made an enormous impact. They have been a source of inspiration. And for the United Nations also, they have been a partner in many of almost all of the landmark international UN conferences. They always came. They sent representatives. They brought a lot of signatures, and they made speeches, statements. They shared really excruciatingly difficult personal experiences with the atomic bombs. Yeah. And that was the reason why those diplomats were negotiating disarmament treaties. Yeah. They felt that this was an important thing.
But those treaties, Ms. Nakamitsu, are now under threat, as we've heard, as we've been hearing, with leaders like Donald Trump coming back to power in the United States. He pulled the US out of the Iran nuclear deal. How do we get those back on track and put the world on a safer path?
Well, as has been mentioned already, diplomacy is the only way. Engagement, dialogue, and diplomacy, those are the key words and key actions that we must take now. Now, first thing first, let us absolutely make sure that we maintain and protect the nuclear taboo. We've been hearing this word throughout the day today. Nuclear taboo must be absolutely upheld and protected. And then from there, let's make sure that we share a common sense of the risk that we have at the moment. My good friend Raphael said that he is concerned. We actually are living next to a very acute risk. I would still like to believe that no political leaders will intentionally use nuclear weapons. But the risk of miscalculation, misunderstandings in a time of war, without any opportunities for diplomacy, dialogue, engagement, is really enormous. So we have to make sure that the risk is reduced. That's also diplomacy. Now, in history, we actually have seen some good examples that when the risk was so high, the leaders actually understood that this is not the way that we can pursue. 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, I think that was the moment that the world has gone closest to total nuclear war fighting. Immediately after that, the political leaders understood that this is not the way.
Okay, so they need to pull back. Yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Nakamitsu. Thank you for your time. We have time for one more audience question. Who is the young lady joining us? Yes, join us. What is your name and what is your question to the laureates?
My name is Likumelo, and my question was, I was wondering, what advice would you give to young activists and peace builders who is inspired by the organization's commitment in nuclear disarmament?
Yes, so what advice, Mr. Tanaka, and what advice would you give to the next generation of activists?
Mr. Tanaka, what advice?
Yes. First of all, I would say the future is in the hands of the youth. The future is yours. For those who will be continuing to live in the future, it is up to them to look towards this future and to think about what can be done in order to rid the world of war and of nuclear weapons. If all young people can think about this together and in many different ways, discuss this, thinking about different methods that you can do. For example, there are some people who think about this in a logical way, but not only this, you can think about through emotions, through music, through film, in order to bring people with many different interests together to pay attention and think about what can we do to ensure that people can live happily, that humanity can survive. What can we do together? And I hope that young people will talk about this together. And I think coming up with these kind of ideas together is what will be able to ensure that you can create a peaceful world. And also, not giving up is the other message I would share.
Mr. Mimaki, the Hibakusha are getting older. How do you make sure that that direct experience that you have is passed on forever?
So first of all, peace, war, nuclear weapons, these issues, I really hope that people first be interested in these issues. Norway and Japan are countries which are far away from each other, but I hope that you will all come to Hiroshima, visit Hiroshima, come to the Peace Museum and see for yourself what happened 80 years ago at that time. There are many photos and so on that you can see there, and you can feel, you can understand what happened. In Japan, there is a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so when we think about this, rather than just talking about this, seeing things for yourself, experiencing things for yourself is a way that you can understand more deeply. And so this is how people can understand, well, we really do need to get rid of nuclear weapons. And so I hope that people can, each and every one of them, think about this. Every 2 months in Hiroshima, we have an action calling on the Japanese government to attend the nuclear ban treaty meetings.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I don't think there's anyone who's sat in this wonderful hall today who hasn't been moved by your words and who will never forget your words. It's been a pleasure and honor to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our laureates and to our audience here at Oslo City Hall for being so engaging, and to our experts, our guest experts, of course, for their insight. This has been an Al Jazeera special live from Oslo. I'm Folly Thibault. Thank you very much for watching, and a round of applause for our laureates, please.